Luddites are, we know the term, it's a derisive term for people who are technologically backwards, but the actual Luddites, of course, were weavers, and their jobs were threatened by automatic looms. So what did? They burned the looms. And so now we make fun of them. But it turns out they were right. They all lost their jobs, and that's happened to sector after sector after sector. So it was interesting to hear that come up at the end of the last panel. Here to solve that and many other related problems is the next panel. I should note that Gabe Horowitz from Third Way and Nell Abernathy from Roosevelt also led putting this panel together. And I'm going to introduce the moderator and let her take it from here. The moderator is Angela Hanks. She's the Deputy Executive Director at Groundworks Collaborative, which, as the name suggests, brings together broad-based coalitions of policy experts and advocates to break down issue silos and collaborate in support of shared goals. With that, take it away, Angela.
Great, thank you so much. I will dive right into the panel because we only have an hour and I have a bunch of questions for these folks. So we're just going to do some quick introductions and then we'll go right to the questions. So immediately to my left is Julie Morgan from the Roosevelt Institute, Mary Alice McCarthy from New America, Jeff Dygert from AT&T, and Mike Monroe from the North American Building Trades Union. So we're here to talk about education and skills that are needed for a 21st century economy. And so I thought it would be useful because often with conversations around education and skills, it can become a conversation about a whole range of economic and labor market problems. So I wanted to sort of start with the panelists talking a little bit about, when we talk about education and skills, what are the problems that we're trying to solve? So I'll turn to Julie and we'll go down the row.
Yeah, there are so many problems that we're trying to solve that I'll just pick one or two, and then I'll let my fellow panelists fill in the gaps. But when I think about this particular issue, the major lens through which I look at it is who's paying for these skills, right? Because we know, it's not, we don't have perfect systems, we don't have perfect ways of doing this, but we know that there are ways to increase educational attainment and skills attainment, right? But the way we're doing it right now is primarily by having individuals pay for it. So my colleague, or former colleague, Marshall Steinbaum and I wrote a paper last year that mentioned that between 2007 and 2017, we were able to increase post-secondary attainment by 6%. But in that same time period, student debt went from $200 billion to $1.4 trillion, right? So that has to be a central question here. I think, another lens is how do we ensure that those skills are actually valued and compensated appropriately in the labor market? And then the third piece for me is how do we ensure that there's equal access to those skills and that the earnings that we believe that they will yield are also equally distributed?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the chance to be here. And can I introduce myself a little bit? Yeah, so Mary Alice McCarthy from the Center on Education and Skills at New America. And New America is a think tank that is located down the street. And we have a large education policy program. And I run the Center on Education and Skills, which sits at looks at the intersection of education policy, workforce development policy, and our labor market. So, and these connections between education policy and workforce policy and labor policy are becoming more and more important. So I would say the biggest problem that I think we need to be solving through these policies is to address how education is becoming a driver of inequality and how it is reinforcing inequality. Educational attainment level is an increasingly stark divide in our society. People who complete college, particularly bachelor's degrees, versus people who don't, have very different experiences in our country. An individual's ability to participate in our economy and support their families is increasingly very tied to whether or not they are able to complete some sort of post-secondary education. So to Julie's point, though, we have developed a system in which individuals themselves have to take on the risk of being able to pay for those programs without knowing exactly whether or not they'll be able to complete them and whether or not they will fully pay off. So we need to develop systems that through which we can educate a much broader, through which we can get all Americans through high-quality post-secondary education, and we can make it affordable for them. And part of that needs to be then we have to have more of a shared responsibility around who pays for education and training, and both from the public sector, from the private sector, and individuals, and we have much more of a shared burden around that. I also would just say, the other thing is I think we have, on the one hand, too few options for students and workers to sort of find ways to continue their education, and we need to have more high-quality options. On the other hand, we have too many options, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a minute.
So I work in AT&T's public policy group and handle, among other things, some education issues. And we come at we come here today because we are a very large employer. We have about 250,000 employees. And 10 years or so ago, the people that track this kind of thing at the company realized that we had a really large labor force that was used to doing sort of the same thing for a long time. We had been a telephone company for a long time, and technology had sort of incrementally evolved, but suddenly, because of both some acquisitions and the change of business more generally, the company no longer needed as many people to work on long-distance telephone switches, and suddenly needed a lot more people to work on software and coding and next-generation networks. And so they found themselves with a really large employee base that had been with the company for a long time, and the company, I think, has a tradition of, it's been a union shop for a long time. It's had a tradition of looking out for its employees and consequently has a lot of loyal long-term employees. But that whole population needed to be kind of migrated toward a new set of skills in order to meet the needs that the company had going forward. And because of that, we embarked kind of over a series of years on an increasingly aggressive employee reskilling program. And it was very simply because, the sort of qualifications and skills of our workforce no longer completely matched up with the requirements that we had to grow the business in the direction that it was evolving. And we can talk about this more later, but that very simply is how we come here today, because I think we have the largest employee training population or training program in the country, and I can give you more statistics about that later on, but it's been a very conscious decision by the company to try to keep the people that have been there for a long time, provide them with skills that are more relevant in the current economy, and sort of lift all boats, create a win-win situation.
Thank you again. Mike Monroe with North America's Building Trades Unions. Pleased to be here and participate. And I think to answer your question, I would just simply reply with, we're looking to meet the demands of industry, and we're trying to equip individuals and workers with the skills to command a wage and be successful in that career. And I would add, get home safely at night. I'll leave it at that.
Great. So there's a lot to dig into here. So Mary Alice, actually, I really wanted to go back to something that you mentioned just at the tail end. So, you mentioned that folks at once both have many options, but also don't have enough. And I think something for folks who are in the kind of ed and skills policy space, we've seen a proliferation of different types of credentials, different types of programs, especially over the last decade and a half. Can you talk a little bit about what some of that has been sparked by and some of the challenges that you see as that growth has happened? And Julie, you might want to jump in here as well.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. And yes, there has been a lot of a sort of creativity and generation of sort of new types of education programs over the last decade, below the bachelor's degree level in particular. So I think a lot of, and a lot of it very well-intentioned of like, how do we help people earn valuable credentials short of the bachelor's degree or on their way to the bachelor's degree, and how do we give them more options to acquire valuable skills to do that. So we've seen a real proliferation, for example, within higher education of certificate programs. We've also seen a real proliferation of sort of other types of alternative credentials like certifications and and a whole bunch of things like badges and things like that. Some of these things people can pay, some of them people can pay for using their Pell Grants or their loans. Some of them they have to pay for out of pocket. Some of them are delivered through institutions of higher education and some aren't. So but we've we've got our institutions of higher education and other sort of organizations building these new credentials in an effort to help people move through the labor market a little bit better and be able to document their skills. And that's a good thing. We want people to be able to sort of demonstrate, have a credential that shows what they know and can do. But the problem is that when people have to pay for those, they also need to know what it is they're paying for and whether or not it's going to pay off for them. And that's where we have a sort of a higher education, in particular, financing system that sort of incentivizes institutions to create a lot of these types of credentials, but doesn't hold them accountable if the credentials themselves don't actually turn out to be valuable. And so this is probably we call the space, you could call it the sub-baccalaureate education space or the non-degree credential space. It's an extremely risky one for students and for taxpayers, because we don't, as I said, hold the institutions accountable for whether or not that credential actually has value in the labor market. One of the things I think is just really important for us to always understand in the education policy space too is that students are when they make choices around what they're going to study and what they're going to pay for, it's very aspirational, or sometimes also very motivated out of a sense of urgency of wanting to finish as quickly as they can, right? So when there's a wide availability of sort of different types of credentials that maybe they can get fast, or that maybe sort of look really like, oh, it has the word IT in it or computer in it, and that's, they, again, people make decisions for a lot of reasons, and we don't provide them with a lot of, first of all, information about what are the returns to those credentials, and in some cases too, we don't do a good enough job of keeping out of the realm of what they can what people can choose, sort of credentials that are not valuable. We have an extremely choice-driven education system in the United States. We like people to be able to choose what they want to study. But we are very averse to regulating the higher education market. And as a result, we expose people to a lot of risk of programs that don't potentially pay off. And we're doing that at a time when we are expecting people to finance their education more and more through debt. So it's a really vicious kind of circle, and we have to figure out a way out of this moving forward.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is similar to the way that I look at it. I think the way that I look at it that's like a little bit different is, first of all, we talk about it as a choice-driven system, but it's a system that was set up to subsidize private and public providers. And that choice to subsidize private providers created a huge opportunity for extraction, profitable extraction from government programs. And we haven't found a good way to regulate ourselves out of that, basically. And it's incredibly hard to regulate our way out of that because we have to get into these nitty-gritty questions about value. So I think, to me, thinking about the incentives that the structure of the system, first of all, in terms of eliminating subsidies for for-profit providers that are just extracting from the program, and then thinking about the incentives that we set up for schools. So I think you did a great job describing the lower end of the credential scale. There's the opposite thing happening at the top end, right? Where, and Kevin Carey has written about this, you have schools that are offering master's programs that are extremely cheap to provide, and they're charging a lot of money for those programs. It's a version of the same thing, which all relates back to the incentives that even public institutions are facing, where they are really driven by revenue, and they're finding the easiest ways to get those revenue streams. So I think that has to be part of the way that we think about it. The other thing I think about is the concept of choice and risk, again, is not evenly distributed across the student body, right? I didn't really have to worry that much about the value of my college degree because, first of all, I had others helping me pay for it. And secondly, based on the types of schools that I attended, there just wasn't as much risk, right? You are on a path that takes you upward. And those opportunities are not evenly distributed based on income, and they're also not evenly distributed based on race. So there are these more structural factors that we have to address in addition to providing more accountability.
And I want to move on in a second to talk about some of the efforts that you all are engaged in to sort of connect the training and the relevance to make sure that value is there. But I just wanted to also just ask one more follow-up question on this question of risk and sort of structural forces. So there is this open question about, depending on your race, income, wealth, what the returns are to education. And as Mary Alice mentioned, we're also talking about education that is increasingly financed by debt. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the challenge with having a system that is largely debt-driven with a population where we know that there are unequal returns to education based on race, gender, income, wealth, all of those things?
Yeah, so I think, we should always have that in the back of our mind, that there are unequal outcomes in the labor market based on race. I'm not sure it enters into the policy conversation as much as it ought to. The thing within the higher ed policy that really brought it to a head was the release, I think 2 years ago, of some data on student loan defaults that showed that Black borrowers defaulted at a rate, within an 11-year period, defaulted at a rate of 50%. So fully half of Black borrowers are defaulting on their student loans, which is crazy. It's twice as high as white borrowers, and just on its face, it is alarming, right? And I think that brought to a head these questions of the way that the higher education system is structured. First of all, when the federal government got involved in funding higher education, there was this idea that it was going to help the very people who were seen being hurt by the system right now. So that's just as a baseline. But then secondly, the assumptions that we make about that lead to a debt finance system of higher education are like race blind assumptions, right? They don't take any of this into account. And so I think we are slowly going through this kind of process of reframing how we think about who is hurt by student debt, whether or not student debt is kind of the sort of, I think it was generally thought of as kind of like a, I don't know, benign way of funding education. And we're finding, first of all, it doesn't, on the whole, pay off in the way that we thought it would, but it certainly doesn't pay off for students of color the way that we thought it would. I think we're still at the beginning of figuring out how that shapes education policy, but we got to do it a lot faster.
Yeah. We've talked about sort of the big higher ed and workforce system that exists in this country, but sort of like, what are we preparing people for? I think, Jeff, the AT&T model is really interesting because, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, you all know exactly what you're looking for, right? Like, you have a skill set that you've identified, your technology is changing, your company is changing, and you all have tried to fill that. So can you talk a little bit about what some of the outcomes there have been, and maybe even some advice you'd have for other employers that are going through similar technological shifts?
Yeah, we have, well, there's, at some point along the way, I don't know exactly when it happened, but at some point along the way, there was a very deliberate attempt to sit down and map out the skills and competencies that a broad range of jobs in the company required, and sort of match those up with certificates or nano degrees or some other sort of educational vehicle. And in some cases, there wasn't a good source for the skill out there, and we created in-house training programs. I should back up and say each year the company spends about $200 million on training, employee training, and adds on top of that about $24 million of tuition assistance. So, which is obviously paid to outside education providers. So there's a real attempt to focus on some of the equity issues that you're talking about. But so they did this process of, figuring out what the different jobs required. Employees were encouraged to sit down and assess themselves against this list of requirements. And there's actually now an online system that the company's put together that kind of allows people to match their skills up against the skills for a particular job that they may want to move into. And it has a tool that allows you to link to the training programs or certificates that may be necessary to let you take the next step. So I think the company's been very sort of intentional and I think successful at fixing this problem that your question raised. We also, more recently, have started engaging with other companies and some educational institutions to kind of bring this set of, skills more broadly, make them more broadly available. There are a series of projects sort of sprinkled around the country. We're involved in 2 or 3 of them that have taken a particular focus. Like there's one out in Palo Alto that, not surprisingly, involves tech workers. And we are partnering with a community college in the area, as well as a 4-year college and 3 or 4 other tech-focused employers that operate in sort of the Northern California area, in an attempt to fix another one of the problems that Mary Alice was talking about, which is that you don't necessarily have schools teaching what students need. So we've kind of taken this skills mapping exercise externally to help the education partners in this project map out their courses in a way that you're really going to have graduates coming out that are able to meet the requirements that employers have. And then I guess the last part of your question, I think, was success. And I don't have a lot of hard numbers about the success, but I have seen, mostly because I didn't bring them with me today, but I have seen numbers that show that internally, for the people that have, engaged actively with the training resources, they have like a 2 or 3 times greater chance of succeeding in getting a new job in the company and have, better outcomes in whether they're staying in their current job or moving into a new job than people that haven't engaged with those resources. So there's been, we love measuring stuff, right? It's a big company, and there's no reason you can't get numbers about everything. So there's been an attempt to look at that very thing, and the results are sort of what you'd expect.
So Mike, I think when we think about unions, we typically think about sort of worker power and all of the levers in terms of bargaining over wages and benefits and working conditions and all these things that we value. But unions are also big trainers. They're some of our most prolific trainers in the country. Can you talk a little bit about the building trades and what you all do to train your members, and then how that kind of ripple effects into the broader communities in which
Happy
you're
to do
located?
that, and thank you again. So look, I represent an organization that represents 14 international craft unions. We invest $1.6 billion annually in private capital and workforce development. It is one of the largest post-secondary education systems in the country. Its underpinning is the Fitzgerald Act. I don't know if that rings a bell for anybody in here if you were around in the 30s. It is the National Apprenticeship Act and sets forth standards, right? And fundamentally, an apprenticeship is a structured learning environment, right? That incorporates structured on-the-job training with relevant classroom-based, industry-related instruction. And the Fitzgerald Act was set forth after a federal commission was out there examining what was happening. And essentially employers were deeming helpers as apprentices and having them just sort of on-time training for various menial tasks, not equipping them with skills that were portable or certainly even met the demand of industry over the long term. And so that committee influenced the legislation, and the Secretary of Labor was directed to set up and promulgate regulations to protect the welfare of the apprentice, I think is the actual language in the statute. And from there, you want to, again, there's an agreement that's put in place, okay? So the worker has a voice in this. And an underpinning of the success of our program, quite frankly, is collective bargaining. And we think the durability of the system has been collective bargaining. So it's jointly managed. We are constantly in communication with our employer counterparts who know what they need on their job site or in their industry. We're constantly upskilling and upgrading. But that agreement is central to this, right? Because it sets forth the wages, the term of indenture, the skill or the tasks that will be undertaken on the job, which should be varied and relevant. Because in essence, these folks have deferred wages to make sure that the outcome, and they know the outcome will be that they then have skills that are portable, that can command a wage that'll, quite frankly, put them in the middle class and maybe keep their family in the middle class for generations. So there is a lot of new and innovative things out there. Apprenticeship's a sexy word around this town. But we think what our system has been over 100 years successful, and some of the most cost-conscious entities of construction services know they can rely on our pool of skilled labor because of the veracity of the system, because of the structured learning. And the employee, the individual, again, there's a graduated pay scale through all of this, so a 4 or 5 year program, you may be making, for round numbers, $30 an hour package for a journey person. Maybe you start at 15 in the first year, you're at 22 the second year, and so on, right? And again, you've deferred some of those wages. That employer knows I can pay you less because, again, you're not there yet, but you're deferring that because you know you will get there. So I would refer people to the Fitzgerald Act. I would refer to our structure as something to uphold, and I would remind folks that an underpinning of that and the success of that is collective bargaining.
Mary Alice, I know you've done a lot of work thinking about sort of the growth and quality of apprenticeship programs as they've become, as you said, the cool thing in the federal policy space. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the activity is there?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes, we are super excited about apprenticeship, and of course the building trades have been showing that it is this incredibly high quality education and training model that has a triple bottom line. It's good for the workers, it's good for the employers, and it's good for the communities where these apprenticeship programs are taking place. So we've been thinking a lot about how do we take this fantastic model and bring it to a lot more careers and a lot more occupations, but in particular a lot more career fields. In the United States, the way most of our career education works is that it's delivered through higher education. So if you're going to work in healthcare and you're going to move your way up to be a doctor or a nurse or a medical technician of just about any kind, you're going to need an educational credential. The same is true in IT. The same is true in business and finance. Other countries use apprenticeship, this fantastic model, to prepare workers for those kinds of jobs as well. So we've been thinking a lot about what it would mean to do that, and we think that there's good reason to do it. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but I want to go back to the point that Mike was making about how apprenticeship provides this structured learning opportunity, right? And that is the thing, that is such an important key of that model. A lot of our higher education programs don't provide that kind of structure. Students come when they, it's all on the student to sort of get themselves to the classroom, get themselves through their degree program, figure out how to take the right courses, and complete it all on their own. Apprenticeship is a structured learning opportunity in which the employer is invested in that person's success and make sure that they get there, in which they have access to all sorts of supports both on the job and in the classroom. So I feel like on our higher education system, a lot of where our policies are taking us is towards less and less structure, and we're trying to think about how to get to models like apprenticeship within higher education that provide more structure. And what would it mean to do that? I mean, other countries are combining their degree programs with apprenticeship. In Germany and Switzerland and the UK, increasingly you can do both things at once, earn a university degree and do it through an apprenticeship type model. It's not impossible to do, it's just not how, but our policies don't necessarily make it easy. And so we've been thinking, I could go into some of those policies specifically, but in particular, what is very hard is that if an employer like AT&T wants to train its, bring on employees through an apprenticeship model, it has to set up that program within the company. And then it also needs an education partner, and it needs to figure out who pays the tuition of that student when they go into that education partner to earn their degree. In addition to their journey card. And some of those things around how we finance higher education aren't very friendly to that particular part of the equation. So at New America, we've published some policy recommendations around how to bring our apprenticeship system and our higher education system together so that students can be apprentices, college students can be apprentices, and apprentices can go to college at the same time.
And if I could add, that is a feature of our programs now. It's not the either or. And again, we talked about increasing costs of college student debt. These are debt-free opportunities. I think that we haven't marketed them as such, right? Guidance counselors, school counselors don't talk about them. But now our folks can also get their credential for the industry, the craft, but they're also getting 2 years bachelor's. And I mean, we're able to get college credits and college degrees at the same time. So the sky's the limit, quite frankly, and it's not an either or choice. And again, we think cost competitive at the end of the day.
Yeah, so we've talked about a bunch of different strategies and barriers to accessing and completing post-secondary education and training. I want to talk a little bit about what some of the policy solutions are. We've talked a lot about some of the actual engagement strategies. But if folks could just talk about some of the things they're excited about on the policy front that would help folks access credentials, that would minimize the risk, that would make sure that they were quality, that would make sure that the returns were more equitable. It's a lot of challenges to address, and so I just want to start us thinking about what those things might be.
Yeah. I'm still on what makes me pessimistic.
We can start there. It's
turn.
okay.
You know, just listening to you all talk about apprentice programs, it calls to mind one of the more alarming things that's happening in the higher education space, which is something called an income share agreement, a human capital contract, where it's basically the inversion of that, right? You have these schools that say that they're paying you along the way and then give you a bill at the end to pay a percentage of your income over a period of years. And again, the difference there is who holds power, right? It's what you're saying. Where you have worker power, you have a system that works for the workers and for the employers. Where we have a system that has eroded worker power across the board, we have a system that prioritizes extraction and profits for financial institutions, and that packages that all in a way that somehow makes it sound good to students, right? I was talking to someone the other day about how it was somebody younger than me, maybe 10 years younger than me, who said, I can't imagine living in a world where we invest in people like that, because we don't. And so we have convinced students that it's a fair deal to pay 15% of your income over the next 10 years to get a degree that both is of value to you, but is really of value to your employer and to society. And so on the policy solutions that I'm optimistic about, it's the shift in the debate at the federal level, although it's maybe not showing up in the bills that are being produced right now, but the shift in the debate towards more public investment, towards federal-state partnerships to really prioritize public higher education. In our work at Roosevelt Institute, we are thinking about it as reinvigorating public higher education as a public option, not something that stands in sort of like a massive market of different options all on the same level, but something that is really meant to provide universal access to higher education and to set a floor for quality within the field. So I'm excited about that.
Could I was just going to jump on that last point about federal resources. I think the federal government has a role to play, but I also think we were talking about sort of shared priorities here. And who pays and who gets in. I think employers have a responsibility here and an obligation, and I think that goes back to where we have collective bargaining. They're not going to do this on their own, perhaps, but where there's that conversation, it fosters this dialogue and these outcomes. And particularly given where the tax code resides right now, I think there's enough money in the system for these companies and these corporations to invest in their workforce. And I think we would like to see more apprenticeship agreements as opposed to non-competes out there, right? So I think to get back again to what works, but there is a little bit of a jump ball going on right now. This administration has embarked on a path, and there was a rulemaking, a proposed rulemaking in a public comment period that just wrapped up this summer, and the final rule is yet to be promulgated around IRAPs, is what they're called, industry recognized apprenticeship programs. And it's got some people concerned because, again, you're setting up these parallel systems without any rigor, without any standards, without any of these guidelines and structures that would lead you to the outcomes that you expect, but yet we're going to slap apprenticeship on it to say we did something. So there's a jump ball here. And again, I would just revert back to how I started my comments. There are some things that have worked over time. Sure, we will look for innovative ways to apply them and look to expand them into other industries, but we should not hijack the process, right, in the hopes of, we've created something new. And again, for the construction trades, I'm glad that we followed the last panel because we need to invest in the demand. We need to invest in resources that will demand, or seek then these people to fill these positions. We're not going to train people to put them on a shelf to then later pull them off, right? We need to, our ranks rise and lower to meet the demand. When the economy fell out, the bottom fell out, there was not a lot of work. We're not going to train people for jobs that don't exist, and I think that's another problem. There's no connectivity to the real labor market, right? Go get another degree somewhere, and then good luck. So
So
I would
as we're
just say
talking
that.
about ed policies, should we also be thinking about what labor policies need to be complementary in order to make this? these
I
systems
think
work?
so, and again, I think we mentioned earlier about barriers to entry. We've been working with that. A success story with this administration has been, we've set up, we had about 10 years ago, about 5 apprenticeship readiness programs, which were focused primarily on communities of color, women, and veterans who had been disadvantaged or historically excluded from the construction crafts. And in a year's time, with a few $1 million, we have brought 5,000 people out of potentially poverty and on a path to the middle class. So I think from public policy, we want to remove barriers, advantage sort of these pre-apprenticeship programs, apprenticeship readiness programs, but then tie them to a system that works, that is tied to real employment. And of course, again, if you're undercutting wage standards or trying to weaken labor standards or regulations that exist through the National Apprenticeship Act, I would suggest you're undermining any chance of positive outcomes on this. So ideological forces that I think seem to be motivating some of these new constructs that are being promoted right now currently, that have an anti-labor bias and an animus, I think is cutting your nose off to spite your face, quite frankly. We're more than capable partners here, and it's another success story that collective bargaining does work.
Great, thanks. And I think we have time for folks to get in last comments, and then we've got to move to Q&A. So I'll turn to Mary Alice and then Jeff.
Okay, I'll go back to the question around what I'm optimistic about. And I will say there are a few things on the federal policy front, although I'll save those for last because there's not that many. But there's a lot of exciting stuff, I think, happening in states and cities around the country, and I think in the education and training space. And I think it's worth paying attention to those. In particular, we're seeing more and more states sort of understand that leveraging their community college system, in particular to make sure that more young people get into college and sort of the many different flavors of free college are an important sort of recognition that, first of all, states really did sort of over the last decade pull back too much on their investments in higher education, and that they, in order to be competitive, in order to have state economies that are more fair and competitive, they're just going to have to invest in getting more people into post-secondary education. And that they can't limit those investments to young people, that they're also going to have to consider about adults. So we've seen a little bit of move on the state front of some reinvestment in education and some new thinking around how to make post-secondary portions of post-secondary education free. And particularly, we see things like the Tennessee Promise program, all of the Promise programs, and Tennessee Reconnect that's focused on adults. We're also seeing a lot of state activity, a lot of state interest in apprenticeship, and some interesting investments there. So again, I'm actually, apprenticeship is a fun thing to talk about because we are in a period where we have a new generation of young people who haven't heard a lot about apprenticeship, and when they hear about it and they hear about how they can get paid to learn and potentially even get a college degree, they get very excited about it. So I do think it's maybe not the right place for federal policy, but it's a great place for state policy, and we're seeing like California making big investments in apprenticeship. Washington, Colorado has made some important steps towards sort of creating statewide apprenticeship systems for young people and for adults across a whole wide range of industries. And then I will say, just on the federal front, again, we are in the process of reauthorizing the Higher Education Act. This is an incredibly important piece of legislation. We are talking about $150 billion worth of money on the table. So this is an important conversation. It's not all great, but one of the issues that I think it keeps coming to the surface, it keeps coming to the top, is the need for more transparency. And there does seem to be some more bipartisan consensus on the fact that we just cannot continue to ask people to spend money or to spend taxpayer dollars on programs without knowing what we're getting from them. So I'm a little bit optimistic about that.
So I think most of AT&T's work has proceeded on the assumption that we're going to go without government policy, and we and other major employers are going to sort of strike our own partnerships with education providers in particular and try to fix the most immediate problem for us. We've engaged a little bit on some of the funding issues in the Higher Education Act and tried, mostly through an association, tried to make it more friendly to sort of these non-degree style programs. And then, this is me, not AT&T, but I have to say that on the pessimistic side, I'm a little pessimistic that we are going down this hole of credentials and nano degrees and so dramatically getting away from the notion of liberal arts education, because I may be a dinosaur in this regard, but I feel like we have overcorrected a little bit toward this question of, what exactly it is that employers want, and moved somewhat to our social detriment away from considerations about education as kind of an independent good and creating more well-rounded people and learning how to think and problem solve in a way that doesn't have immediate application to a specific task at work. Don't tell my bosses I said that.
Can I just add a point to that? Yeah, 'cause
Sorry, I knew I was going to have
agree
to
with
turn
you.
to the other folks on the panel.
And I'm with you too. And I think you raised such an important point because, again, when you talk about the work that you're doing at AT&T and how you're working with education partners, that's the way we should think about how to help our institutions of higher education create sort of programs that are skill-specific or occupation-specific in close coordination with an employer partner. What's been happening, and what I would fear continues to happen, is that we've created a system that allows higher education to sort of create these, these kinds of programs, certificates, and nano degrees, frankly, without ever consulting you at all. And the more that that career and skills education happens not in partnership with employers, the less likely it is to be successful. And we are seeing a lot of the way our programs are structured. It's too easy for I always say it's too easy. Our programs make it too easy for institutions of higher education to deliver poor quality, not valuable skills education, and too hard for them to deliver high quality, really relevant skills education.
All right, Julie, I'll let you have the last word here.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to bring up one thing that maybe has been bubbling under the surface that we haven't actually said. So you mentioned that we want to change education policy, we want to change labor policy. I think we also need to change structural economic policy writ large. We're both not doing a great job of figuring out how to get people to acquire new skills, but we're also just not paying people well for the skills that they already have, right? That's the baseline problem that, sits under all of this. And that's going to require, we've talked about worker power a lot, which is great. That is definitely part of the equation there. But the other part of the equation is deconcentrating power within the economy, because we know that concentration among employers holds wages down. So there are a lot of different solutions. I think we tend to put too much emphasis on the education space and not enough on the other factors that drive both education policy and the outcomes that we see.
Great. So thank you so much to the panel. We have a few minutes for questions if folks want to ask these guys anything they weren't able to answer. Got someone there right in the back over on this side.
Hi, I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin, and I was born shortly after World War II, so I come from a different world than you. When education was not expensive, but also when very often in large companies, companies did some of the training, and I guess that's what the man from AT&T was talking about. But now, listening to the news, it sounds like employers expect all the training to be done by the time they hire someone, and they say, well, we can't find anyone with this skill. Well, sometimes skills are very specific, and employers should train people and pay them while they're training. It's not a broad skill thing like an apprenticeship, but for that particular company, employers should be training beginning workers on higher skills in the same company and not expect the employee to have done it all or to go out and get the training and come back. They have enough money. Business has been very profitable for a long time.
Yes, we agree. And I think, this is not an entirely new thing for AT&T. I think our training was much more sort of on the job and apprentice-like back around the time you were born, because there were these great big buildings full of complicated technical machinery, and we hired people who had, you know, skills that would predispose them to this work, but there was also a lot of very AT&T specific engineering and maintenance and repair that, and building anew, that was wrapped around the telephone network. And, you know, as the network became more reliant on electronics that come in sealed boxes and don't admit to a lot of looking under the hood, those skills, our workforce increasingly moved away from those skills, but there are still, I mean, we still have, you know, hundreds of miles of fiber that we lay, and cell towers that we build, and copper lines that many of us still rely on for either broadband or old-fashioned telephone service. And all of the skills around installing and maintaining those are very unique to a few companies like mine, and we recognize that there's a lot of on-the-job training that has to be done. And I think, I mean, we pay good wages, and we have for decades been a company that hires people all across the country. I heard just this morning how not that long ago we were the largest employer in the country, and had people in every city and town and hamlet because every one of those spots had, you know, a telephone network that needed to be maintained.
And I just want to add, that's such a great point, and I agree with you. And I think as we think about the policy, we have to come back to the question is, what is the problem we're trying to solve with our higher education policies and with our just supports for education in general? And there has been sort of a shift in the debate. It really took off during the recession, where suddenly then higher education is about solving skill gaps. And that's not the original promise of the Higher Education Act. And so we have to be careful that we don't use our programs like our Pell Grant program in order to sort of solve problems that aren't the problems of higher education, but really are problems that businesses need to solve themselves. And this is a particular risk with some of the proposals that are on the table right now in Washington, for example, that would take our Pell Grant program. This is our 50-year-old signature program designed to help low-income Americans, all Americans, afford college. And there are proposals that would make Pell Grants eligible to pay for very, very short-term job training programs for as short as 8 weeks, and even programs that don't count for college credit. These are for jobs like truck driving and welding and very low, what we would normally not consider to be jobs that require a college education. The rationale for all of that is this idea that, like, there are skills gaps out there and employers need these, you know, there is tremendous demand for truck drivers. There's also tremendous turnover in truck drivers, in large part because these are very difficult jobs and maybe not very good jobs. So let's make sure we don't use our important programs that are designed to address inequality in access to high quality to degree programs and solve the wrong problem with it. We certainly don't want those dollars going in particular to sort of low-road employers that won't engage in collective bargaining and don't support their workers. Not talking about AT&T here.
And I think, again, you know, skills gap debate, which again is a nice buzz thing around here, particularly around this town. I think we want to have an economics debate. You know, there may be a shortage of truck drivers, yeah, because they don't want to pay them, they don't want to work for $12 an hour, okay? So let's talk about the economics, and amen, sister, in the back.
Any other questions from the audience? And there's another person right here after that.
Thanks. I guess there's the window to comment on the SEC's human capital regulations is open for about 10 more days. Curious if anybody on the panel has ideas about what those comments want to say, what they'd like the SEC to do.
Yeah, it makes me want to look at them. Great question.
At some point now, a long time ago, some colleagues and I had recommended that companies report their investments in training and do it disaggregated by the classification of employees. So, you know, going to Jackson Hole for a weekend with your CEOs might not count, but training your frontline workers with skills that you tell them they need would. So that's one thing that some colleagues at Center for American Progress and I have written about before.
Thank you. I think this is a question for Jeff, is your name, at AT&T. Do you think that changes are necessary in the way we account for that companies account for investments in their workers?
Yeah, I am probably not the right person to ask that because I don't know exactly how we account for that. My understanding is that it's already viewed as an expense and is therefore, taken off the bottom line in the year that it's incurred, which is a favorable treatment and short of getting some sort of added bonus, which I guess is not beyond the realm of possibility these days, given our current administration. I think that it's being treated as favorably as it should be treated from a financial accounting standpoint. But that is a very uninformed answer because I don't know a lot about our financial accounting for those expenses.
I do think there's some interesting proposals out there around how to potentially, allow businesses to think about their investments in training and their employees in the same way they think about investments in equipment. Right. And would that spur more more willingness to invest and really sort of recognize that their employees are a critical part of their
Right.
capital. So.
Yeah, as I understand, it used to be that expenses or investments in equipment were depreciated over time. Those days are mostly behind us, and they're now expensed to a large extent, if not entirely, which is about as favorable as you can get for financial treatment. So I'm not aware of a better way to do it.
Well, I think we need to emphasize return on investment long term, right? And look at it that way. I think fundamentally that's been skewed. I always find it funny that some people, they don't want the government to do anything, but they want the government to train their workers. And I think that there is a story to tell, or at least we should be looking at ROI, and maybe even, there was insurance was mentioned in the last panel, maybe risk mitigation, right? I mean, if you have a skilled, equipped, safe workforce, isn't there a bottom line feature to that too? If we're expensing equipment, maybe we can talk about the long-term return on investment or even risk mitigation through the training and skilling up of your workforce. Just throwing that out there.
I had a question. My name is Carlos and I work for PolicyLink. So, Yuli, thank you for bringing the equity lens. Just curious to follow up on something that you mentioned about debt. Curious to know the data with a racial lens on it. But I participated in a brainstorming session a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that came out of that when I tested with you all is, and maybe I get in trouble because I am in NYU, but what if I, as a student, go to school, 4-year or college, and you guarantee me a job after those 2 years or 4 years. If I don't get the job that you promised me, I will get my money back. I know that I may get in trouble, but if we are trying to tackle, real challenges, we need to come up with those bold, crazy things that might not be possible in the short term, but something can come up out of it.
Yeah, let's see. So on the data on debt, we know that students of color borrow at higher rates, and then they also default at higher rates than white students. And there's a lot of good work going on right now about the relationship between student debt and wealth that I think adds to the way that we think about it. On the question, I think there are, I'm trying to understand what exactly the model is, but I think there are good models for employer investment in higher education and in helping to pay some of the costs. I think right now, sometimes because student debt has become so high, we actually see the opposite happening, where like really little investments in helping to pay off people's debt are being used to lure people to work for you. So you have companies who are like, well, you can trade in some of your, instead of us contributing towards your retirement, we'll contribute towards your student debt. And it's like, I can't understand why people can't have like vacation, sick pay, retirement, and no student loan debt like that.
They can.
But, right. So I think it really requires a shift in the way that employers think about their role here.
And then over here and over here.
So I'm Carolina Young. I'm from Senator Mark Warner's office. I just wanted to respond really quickly to the SEC reporting requirements. So the senator has been a big advocate for these changes and has been proposing that the SEC change their disclosure requirements. His big takeaway is that in our tax code, accounting, and disclosure requirements, there's not a single thing that incentivizes employers to invest in workers long term. And so we really need to be shifting our thinking on accounting and the tax code and disclosure requirements to make sure that those investments are part of a company bottom line. So things like tax credits for companies that invest in worker training, not dissimilar from the R&D tax credit that we already have on the books that is pretty successful. Making sure that companies are disclosing information about how they train their workers based on classification issues as well. We also recognize that companies like AT&T are wonderful in terms of training their full-time employees, who are now, I think you're about 250,000 or so. But, that's a shift from previously having about 400,000 workers, so you've cut lots of jobs in the process and still have, a couple of different contractors in working for the company long term. And so there's sort of this shift that's happening for all of these sort of tech companies where you're now, which is part of the broader skills polarization problem that we have. And so I was kind of wondering what are some solutions on that front in particular as well, making sure that every single worker, not just a full-time worker, is invested in, and that companies are really thinking about those things long term. That's still kind of an open question.
And I would say I think we do need to be careful that we are not making our Pell Grant program something that's going to accelerate those trends towards employers being able to have making it easier for them to have even more of an arm's length relationship with their employees and having the government train them with those proposals. So I share, that's a real concern.
I would also just add that I think this is what Julie was talking about at the end with the kind of, this is a structural economic issue. So contracting and misclassification, part of this is the term that David Weil coined, workplace fissuring. You don't work your way up from the mailroom anymore because the mailroom is a bunch of people who only sort the mail, and that's as high as you can go. So some of those challenges make it harder to provide training, because what's the incentive if there is no ladder within the company? So breaking up of internal labor markets is a big part of this as well, or the challenge that. Oh, we're over. Okay. I'm sorry I didn't get to some of the questions, but thank you so much to the panelists. This has been really wonderful.